Hello, everyone, and welcome to COM 450. Now, you probably got my note via video earlier today. Had sort of a weird emergency situation come up last week, so hopefully you'll forgive me for that. I just want to catch us up from where we left off to where we are now. And the majority of this does not require you to do a bunch of reading so much as just critically thinking about what's going on in current events. So what I'd like to do is, you just finished an essay for me, I know, last week, but I'm going to put up another discussion board. Again, you'll have a full week to do it. I wouldn't worry about it too much, except that it will be worth enough points to matter because I want you to really think about some of the things that we talk about today. The last time that we met, we finished off talking about the different paradigms or the different ways of coming at political communication and the different ways that we might study it. Those ways are determined by the questions that we ask. Was a presidential inaugural effective? Was it within steeped in the tradition? Did it meet ethos, pathos, and logos? Right? All of those questions can be answered in a very specific way. How effective was it, and what impact did it have on the audience is a completely different question. So we have those four paradigms that we sort of go back to for determining what type of research we should do to answer the type of question we're looking to answer. Now, most of you already know that I mostly am a rhetorician. I also did my dissertation not in rhetoric, but in qualitative political communication analysis. So I actually had 22 focus groups that I analyzed, and it was not fun. First recording them, and then typing them all out. The words are escaping me today. Transcribing them, and then having to look through them and find themes and go from there, and then explain how I got to the themes and what those themes mean. In the end, I hated my dissertation topic, but I still enjoy doing qualitative research. Now, questions of effect are questions that I don't usually answer, and I'm in fact very, very, very afraid of effects questions because I'm terrible at math. And a lot of times when you're looking at effects, you have to use that really quantitative side of our research field in order to truly understand what an effect is. Now, as a rhetorician, I can make an argument for what I believe the effect would be, but that's all it is me making that argument. So if I want an answer that is really like sort of ingrained in scientific research, then I would have to use more quantitative methods, surveys, or like the, what is it called? The perception analyzer program that we have at the university, or a Dowling system of some sort, etc. So you get the idea. And I wanted specifically to go from that topic to the next topic, which is, in fact, misinformation, disinformation, information, generally speaking. And I'm picking up my phone because I did pull up your syllabus, and I wanted to make sure that I got everything. And so the way we study political communication, moving into information, misinformation, disinformation, takes us through something very, very important, which is the very specific events, the gaffes, the mistakes that people make, particularly political candidates during their campaigns. I'll talk about those in a minute. And also what we call turning points in an event, in a campaign. Now, these have become less important as the proliferation of quote unquote information has, sort of provided us with way too many options to find quote unquote the truth about a candidate. Now, it's not hard to find information about a candidate by looking at their events, their major turning points in their political career, and looking at any mistakes that they have made, gaffes. I don't know if you remember, but not too long ago, but before my time, President Ford apparently used to always trip and fall, especially going up into an airplane, coming out of an airplane. And the press sort of made jokes about it periodically, but it wasn't really a big, important part of Truman's Ford's sort of overall presidential legacy. However, George H.W. Bush talking about it wouldn't be prudent at this juncture, not knowing how to use a scanner in or how a scanner works in a grocery store. George W. Bush's inability to get a word correct most of the time. Bill Clinton's sex scandal. Obama wore a tan suit once. Those kinds of things tend to stick in the mind and define how the polity looks at or views that candidate. So what particular lens are they looking at that candidate through? And sometimes this has, in fact, completely destroyed political careers. One of the examples for this is one of the most famous ones, again, before my time, actually not before my time, but before I really started studying politics, was during a vice presidential debate when George H.W. was running for president. I want to say I was probably 12 or 14 at this time, so I don't remember a whole lot, but I do remember this. In that vice presidential debate, Dan Quayle, who was perceived as young and childlike, couldn't spell potatoes properly, I think. They had a lot of things to pick on him about for some reason. And I would assume that there were a lot of policy reasons to pick on him as well, but we didn't get that because when he was actually debating with the vice presidential candidate at the time, whose name I totally forgotten because he's in the also ran category because Dan Quayle did become vice president with George H.W. Bush. Dan Quayle was comparing himself, his age, particularly how young he was, to John F. Kennedy when he entered into the presidential race, and that he was a similar age and everything. And the response from the other candidate was, "Sir, I have met John Kennedy. You are no John Kennedy," sort of implying that you don't have what he had to work in the office of the president in any way, shape, or form. Anyway, all of those things have really stuck and destroyed careers in a lot of ways. Now, Dan Quayle's career was not destroyed in that moment, but we didn't really see much of him. Not that you see much of any vice president, really. I mean, we don't see them very much. Their sole job is to be there in case something happens to the president. Like, literally, that's it. That's their only job. So very rarely do we hear about them anyway. But that, of course, was a one-term presidency. So, I don't know how successful we want to call that. Pretty successful, I guess. They won. But there were, a number of factors going on at that time. In addition, another one that is before your time, not before mine, but at the Iowa caucuses, and I'm trying to think of the guy's name and it's escaping me. I'm going to find the YouTube video for it, though. There was a candidate who was at the Iowa caucuses and he was looking really good. It looked like he was probably going to win the caucuses and, go on to New Hampshire in the first position. And his name was Howard Dean. That's what it was. And he really came up from behind. He was sort of what we thought was going to be an also-ran, and all these people learned to really love him. And one of the things that he did after he figured that out was he was caught on video going, "Yeehaw, now we're going to New Hampshire and on to the White House." And he was just very excited. And it doesn't sound like yeehaw. It sounds like a scream of some sort, maybe more guttural than that. And his career was over. He did not do well in New Hampshire, and after that, and he just sort of rolled out of the campaign at that point. It was bad. Now, should these things happen, should these gaffes, these mistakes, take out an entire political career? Well, I guess that depends. It did. They did for a few decades, honestly. Now we have, a former president who went up and down the stairs of a of an airplane with various different things that we made fun of temporarily, like toilet paper on his shoe or leaving an umbrella, not able to close it, which was one of the more humorous ones. And these are all funny, but they're not necessarily destructive. Things, same thing with President Biden. Every time he trips, every time he slips, we all go, oh no, he cannot even keep his balance. It's always fun and interesting to see these gaffes, but they don't have the impact that they used to. And one of the reasons why they don't have the impact that they used to is because people have realized how much more goes on that they never paid attention to before. The only thing we had to pay attention to at that time was the mistakes. Now we've got so much more to pay attention to between I don't know, Truth Social. Is Twitter still called Twitter? Is it called X? I don't even know. X, formerly known as Twitter. Facebook, even for those in the Gen X era. Let's see. Television, YouTube, podcasts, videos that people just decide to make up, and the ever popular thing that I mentioned the first night we talked, which was iNews. All of these things produce so much material about our candidates and about our presidents and our government officials that, okay, so somebody tripped on the stairs. It's not that big of a deal. Whereas that would have been a real insight previously. In the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 90s, I guess that would be a real insight. Okay. Some choices that were made were mistakes as well. Most of what I've just talked about were mistakes that happened accidentally, right? But there's also some that have happened on purpose, I guess, is what I want to say, which is to say that somebody chose to do something specific. One of the first real, what's the word I want to look for here, questionable acts that was on late night television was when Bill Clinton agreed to go on late night and play the saxophone. For some reason, that was huge. And that was a choice that he and his campaign made. Now, it didn't destroy his career. He did that in other ways. But he certainly didn't destroy his career or his legacy or anything by playing the saxophone. In fact, it became part of sort of his character as a candidate, as a president, as a former leader of the world. So some of the choices that people have made have been, not problematic so much as just interesting. Presidents who go on late night crack me up. And one of the reasons is because you really get to see who they are. One of my favorites is watching Jimmy Carter. Whenever he goes on to Stephen Colbert's show, or he goes on to one of the other talk shows. And of course, he talks mostly about Habitat for Humanity, but he is a fascinating guy because he's no longer president. So he was president in the 70s. I was extremely young. I don't remember it, to be honest with you. I believe I was actually born when Nixon was still president. But Carter came right after him. And I don't really know. I can't say that I understood this at the time. But now looking back historically, I can certainly see with 2020 vision that Carter made some mistakes as president. I mean, we had the gas crisis, the oil crisis. We had high inflation and low employment rates and lots of things going on in the 70s that we don't really talk about anymore because they really weren't that big of a deal. I mean, I'm beginning to think the most exciting thing from the 70s, besides the pants, was my birth. In a way, I really feel like that was the most exciting thing in the 70s. We didn't have anything super exciting. Yes, Watergate, but it was, way in the beginning, and Vietnam ended in the early 70s. So I guess maybe that would be a defining characteristic. But by the time we get to the 80s, we meet some really interesting characters who make some choices, such as hanging out on late night, showing up in television shows. Now, most of the time, presidents particularly do this after they have been president. When they are no longer president, they'll show up on TV shows, right? Jimmy Carter being a prime example, another one being Barack Obama, another one being First Lady Obama. They all showed up on late night. One of the reasons why I'm saying this and emphasizing it so much is because Bob Dole, who you probably don't know, but Bob Dole ran for president a few times, and Bob Dole talked about himself in the third person. And Bob Dole was very well known in Congress, not as a bad guy. He was a Republican who was well respected, I think, by both sides. Sort of a John McCain character, if you remember him. So anyway, Bob Dole was injured in the war. And he was a real hero, and he always talked about himself in the third person. And I always thought that was fascinating and interesting. I'm not really sure why he always did that, but it became exaggerated, obviously, in late night comedy. After he ran for president, after he lost, he went on to late night television. It had to be like Jay Leno or something. And he was talking, and I turned to my mom and I said, this guy's hilarious. Like, if I had seen this, I might have voted for the dude. Like, seriously, he was that interesting. And you get to see their actual personalities come out. Now that we have iNews and X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook and TikTok and all these others, we're getting things in real time now. And we're not getting a report of what somebody did. We're getting the actual action, okay? And that really started with Howard Dean, and it's really gone crazy to now, which of course we have, infomercial length sales pitches from Donald Trump, right? And from people who support Donald Trump, like the My Pillow guy, right? And I apologize for calling him that. That's really dehumanizing, but I can't remember his name. Mike Lindell. Like Mike Lindell goes on. He talks about how Donald Trump should win. Anyway, my point in telling you all of that is then the question becomes, what is information? What is the truth of that information? What is misinformation and what is disinformation? And you might think, well, those two are the same thing, Dr. D-Dash. What the hell are you talking about? I'm going to give you a small, slight distinction between the two. I don't get hung up on this necessarily, but it's just sort of one of those things that in the field of political communication, we pay attention to. One of the best lines, I think, about information and knowledge in history is that information is fast and cheap. Knowledge is slow and expensive. In other words, it's easy for me to gather a ton of information. I can memorize it quickly if I need to, or I could just refer to it. I just pick up my phone like you saw me do with the syllabus a minute ago, right? I can do all of those things, get it to you really quickly, pound it out. And when we started in the 24-hour news cycle, which was, again, when I was in my early teens, when we started with the 24-hour news cycle with C-SPAN, particularly the advent of cable news, they needed to produce something constantly. Now, C-SPAN was hilarious and lovely because they used to play, and I don't know, maybe they still do. I don't have cable, so I don't know, but C-SPAN used to play the Parliament, like literally live Parliament from London, and it was awesome to watch them. And I was like, why can't Congress be like this? The way that they insult each other, the honesty, the brutalness of it, I really appreciated and enjoyed when I was younger. I'm not sure that I'd appreciate and enjoy it now. I don't like when Congress gets up and screams names at each other. I do like when they debate. That's exciting. And I think C-SPAN still shows that. But C-SPAN did not buy into the, oh my God, we need to make news up for 24 hours. They could show news hours from Australia, all around the clock. They could show different things. And they didn't try to fill that time. So when competition started for cable news shows like C-SPAN supposedly was giving us, they were really giving us just the events. They weren't really talking about it. So there was no analysis. There was no interpretation. You were watching the straight up thing, and you got bored, but you either stuck around and figured it out for yourself, or you went to another news channel during the day and you could watch what you wanted to watch. I am old enough that I do remember when not just TVs didn't have remotes or something like that. I mean, that's all true, but also when all of the television stations went offline, if you will, went off the air, as we used to say, at about midnight to 2 o'clock, depending on where you were at and what channel you were watching. But I remember being a kid and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and, I don't know, go to the bathroom or something, and all I would hear is snow. And I don't know how to explain that to you. It's the sound that you hear when there's static on a television screen. I'm sure that there's YouTube videos of it out there, because my father had fallen asleep watching the television and did not obviously turn off the television because he was asleep, and there's no such thing as a sleep timer back then. I remember that. I do remember that. And right before they went off the air, they always played the national anthem. Okay. So this was a thing. Well, when we went to 24 hours of just constant stuff, we didn't have enough news to fill it up. I know that's hard to believe, but you only had so many journalists and only so many cameras and only so much time to go out and get stories. And so if we wanted to compete with this 24-hour news cycle, we had to make crap up, it felt like sometimes. And I don't mean make stuff up like literally out of the air. I mean things that were not news, we made it news. Like Howard Dean's yell at the end of the Iowa caucuses, or Ford tripping on stairs, or, well, I guess that was a little bit predated, but still. Or, I don't know, pick a random holiday that might have been happening. And this is where we got like human interest stories, like, oh, this is the latest from our local pet rescue. Let's hear about that. Or bringing in puppies. Morning shows started. All of those things developed for the purpose of 24-hour news cycles. That's not to say programming like soap operas or whatnot, those were on, but 24-hour news cycles overnight needed to have something to say. Nowadays, we mostly just get repeats of whatever was said at 6 o'clock, 11 o'clock, right? Like, it's just repeats, it feels like. And also because there's only, I think we're down to 3 major media companies that own everybody, we're not getting a whole lot of variety in our news. We're basically getting like maybe 3 perspectives, most of the time fewer than that. Because the news is put out in packages to everyone so that you could have TV on all the time, 24/7, 365, and be able to watch something. And for those news stations, we're looking at like them coming up with news stories. And so we started to get historical perspectives on things, which isn't bad. It's educational. But it's not news. News seemed to be, at least at some point, current events, things that were happening now, or at least within the realm of the 24-hour period. Something. But unfortunately, information is fast and cheap. Knowledge is very slow and very expensive, because in order to gain knowledge, you have to actually be educated on something. And in order to educate people on something, you have to take the time to educate them, which, by the way, time is money in the industry. So if you're in the media at all, if you're into TV news or even TV broadcast or any of that, what you are looking at is how much money is being spent every time an hour goes by on your television station. That's, advertising revenue that could be gotten. That's a television coverage of something that's happening right then and right there. So very rarely are we educated by the news. More often we're given information. Now, I'm going to pause for 1 second. First of all, to get a drink of water. And second, to say that I'm not trying to imply in some way that the media lies to us. Do they exaggerate? Do they make things more dramatic than they need to be? I don't think these are questions that are really hard to answer. I mean, there was a hurricane that was supposed to destroy us, one of the worst in I don't know, hundreds of millions of years. I don't know. And it turned out to be a tropical storm. I mean, there was just nothing there. But we like to hype those things up, which desensitizes your audience, which means that you better come up with something more dramatic and interesting the next time, right? So what we've done is put ourselves into a place where we're progressively trying to make news be different and exciting and new. And of course, the advent of iNews going all the way up now to TikTok or to even just camera phones. I mean, there are news stations that have contests of pictures of weather that people take randomly, and it gets sent in, and boom, you're on, your picture is being used on TV. Videos that are hilarious and go viral are sometimes on the regular news stations, right? And so one of the things that I enjoy, by the way, this is a total rabbit trail for a second, but Seth Meyers always has, or doesn't always have it, but has a section of his show that pops up every now and then. It's called The Kind of Story We Need Right Now. And if you look at YouTube, you'd find these, and they are hilarious. They're true stories that can be verified. It's not like he's not giving you information, but it's being presented in such a great, funny way that, you don't realize that what you're getting is news. First of all, none of those stories would make the news, most likely, maybe locally, but that would be about it. And second of all, he makes it all sound really, really good, right? And really, really exciting and interesting, but mostly a story that makes you feel good. It's that feel-good news story that he does with humor. Now, all of that is fine. Sorting through information is not so fine. It's incredibly difficult. Now, again, remember, information is fast and cheap. Knowledge is slow and expensive. So what are you learning, hopefully, as you watch or political ads, as you watch debates, as you watch what's going on in the news, how we cover politics, whatever it is that you're interested in, or political issues, all of those things and how they get covered isn't always what we're given. It's a lot of times information, not a lot of knowledge. Your job is to sort through that information and figure out what to hold on to for your knowledge so that you can act, but is irrelevant otherwise. This is not easy. We call it critical thinking all the time. We're like, oh, you need to critically think about this, critically analyze it, really think about it. Sometimes we say that it's a lot easier said than done because it takes time. And the one thing that people do not want in their news, in their videos, in their television set, on their computers is for it to take time. We are incredibly impatient people. Well, the quickest and easiest way to save time is to get your story down to the soundbite, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, or to one image, or to one idea, one thing. And you put that one thing out. It's like a tagline on Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter. It's like a status on Facebook. Although those are excessively long now, so maybe not. But sort of the headline of a newspaper. And that's all you get. Because that's all people think you want. And most of the time that is all people want is that headline. Donald Trump steps on toilet paper. Joe Biden trips on stairs. I mean, take your pick. The first question I have is, what does that have to do with anything? The second is, isn't that entertainment and not information? Why is it on a news program? I mean, being on Seth Meyers, sure, all that's hilarious. But on a news program where I'm supposed to be getting information about the truth of what is happening, it seems like perhaps it's a little bit more important to talk about, the bombings in Israel. But more importantly, what's behind those bombings? What's going on in the Gaza Strip? Not just saying there's bombings in the Middle East, but actually learning about what those things mean. And that takes time. And it's expensive to take that much time. So unless you're one of those nerds like myself who sits down and reads newspaper articles, or better yet, watches news programs on the history of war in the Middle East, you probably don't even know where the Gaza Strip is. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory manner. I couldn't pick it out on a map right now, probably either. But what I do know is that in order to understand the story of why Israel is being bombed, that I probably need to learn about the Gaza Strip, and I need to learn about Hamas and Hezbollah and etc. Now, today I was listening to a news story on radio, and I heard them say that, quote, everyone is blaming Joe Biden for this. And I'm certainly seeing that the president of the United States is being criticized for the deal that he made earlier this year in a trade for hostages. Okay, this is really getting complex. I mean, it's going to take me an hour to explain it to you. Can you imagine how long it took me to figure it out? So I'm not going to spend an hour telling you the story because it's not that important. What is important to us is understanding the difference between information, misinformation, and disinformation. Now, is Israel at war? Yes, that's information. That the person to blame for the war in Israel is President Biden. Not in Israel. None of the Middle Eastern people, reporters or media outlets are reporting that this is Joe Biden's doing. They're talking about Hamas, right? So completely different. Is that misinformation or disinformation? Well, see, politically, people would say that's disinformation, trying to make Joe Biden look bad as a president. And others would say, no, it's just a little bit of misinformation because if you track the involvement of the United States and money into the Middle East, we might understand a little bit better where some people interpret it as it is Joe Biden's fault. So what's the difference? Misinformation is generally information that is a little bit misleading or can be found. The truth of it can be found very easily. It's a shortcut, but it's not an untruth so much as it's just the words that we chose to use. And so the little clips that we choose to use, Israel is at war and it's President Biden's fault. That's two different things that are smashed together in a soundbite for us to take in. Whether we determine we're going to go further with that and try to understand it, or if we're just going to say, well, clearly it's Joe Biden's fault, probably has a lot to do with your perspective and a lot to do with your politics, right? If you're a supporter of Biden, you're less likely to just go, oh yeah, clearly Biden's the president, he's at fault. You're more likely to say, wait a minute, let me dig into this. If you're not a fan of President Biden, you're much more likely to go, yep, he did that, which is interesting. But neither of those are okay reactions if you're really wanting to understand political communication. Disinformation is when you purposefully construct something for the intent of making someone believe an untruth or a falsehood or not the whole truth. For example, what if I said, President Biden has caused war once again in Israel after he freed some hostages? Now, does that sound like an argument? Yeah, it does. He freed some hostages. That seems like, yes, that is true. That happened. He negotiated a deal for millions of dollars or billions of dollars for that to happen. Yep, that's true. We have a claim that Joe Biden is therefore at fault for the Israel war, which means that we've got a warrant in there that his actions could lead directly to war. Great. That's a very long argument. And honestly, it's not true. It's inaccurate. Now, are the pieces inaccurate? No. Is the claim inaccurate based on those pieces of information? Yes. So this is why when we're reading political commentary, when we're reading political propaganda, disinformation comes into play. Now, if you really want to know what political propaganda looks like, I encourage you to see, well, actually, I don't know if I encourage you to see it or not, because I went to the Alamo to watch Oppenheimer. And before the movie came on, and it's a 3-hour movie, it's very long, very good, but very long. During the 3-hour movie, or before the 3-hour movie, they were rolling films of actual propaganda, anti-nuke war propaganda films from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Films that I would have seen, films that I've studied, honestly. And there's a lot of them. It's a lot of propaganda. What do we mean by propaganda? Purposeful disinformation, usually perpetuated by a government entity or someone from a position of power. All right, so is disinformation really that new? No. We've had it around for a long time, from the times of yellow journalism all the way through propaganda, all the way, the propaganda films of the World War II particularly, and then all the way till now with, Lord help me, TikTok, right? We aren't changing anything. We're just getting faster at it. So information is just getting faster and cheaper every day. It's getting faster and cheaper, it feels like. And so what do we have to do in order to counter disinformation and misinformation? If you're trying to move as quickly as the arguments coming against you in a political campaign, your only answer is that's not true. Who has time to explain it, and who's going to listen? So one of the jobs that we have as political communication analysts is paying attention to what events and turning points there are, what impact those turning points are having in terms of the information that is shared, and therefore the knowledge that we can pull or derive from it. So I hope that helps a little bit in understanding the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation is much more intentional, and generally it is political or comes from a higher power entity for the purpose of being misleading, okay? Whereas misinformation just may be incorrect in some small way, unintentionally. And if you want to know if that happens, yeah, all the time. We are misinformed a lot. We are disinformed, I think, more than we realize, but we also don't want to acknowledge it. Nobody wants to acknowledge that you're being lied to purposefully, right? I mean, that's a harsh criticism. So our job is to figure out what is the sort of, I always say, follow the bouncing ball from, the data to the claim. And if you've taken argumentation or you're taking it with me now, you understand that, that you have to take some steps in between there to get to the claim. You can't just assume that your audience agrees with you that, hey, there's a war in Israel. Several months ago, President Biden freed some hostages and boom, it's his fault. There's no explanation in there at all whatsoever, but it is the fastest, quickest way to say it. So what have we learned today? Hopefully you've learned a little bit about how events, gaffes, and turning points can shift a campaign, being able to recognize those, and how they are used as part of a misinformation or disinformation campaign, and propaganda. All right. And that type of political communication is political communication we need to avoid. Here's what I'm going to do. I know it says that you're supposed to have a midterm. I think this week, it was this week or last week. I think I told you at the beginning of the semester, I'm not a big fan of tests. So instead of doing an exam, here's what I would like to do instead. I am going to put up a series of sort of like political gaffes that have been made, usually in presidential debates. And what I would like you to do is to look at those as events, turning points, gaffes, whatever, and sort of try to figure out what the argument might be that's actually being made. Now, is this going to require a ton of work on your part? Probably a little bit more than me. I mean, I've been studying this crap for so long. I feel like I've lived a couple lifetimes studying it sometimes. But you'll be able to easily find something to write, and it's an opinion piece. Remember that. Back it up however you can. But I want you to watch the video, and then I want you to give me an explanation of what you think the true argument is in that video. And this will actually be counted towards as your midterm. So it's worth as much as your midterm. I'll probably give you several to choose from. You'll probably do more than one, maybe a couple. I will give you 2 weeks to do it because fall break is coming up. And, hey, even though we don't get fall break, it seems unfair to have you guys have to have a test or an essay due. And I always said that I would give you 2 weeks. So I'll be putting that up for you, not tonight, but tomorrow morning, and then we will go from there. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, etc., please let me know as usual. Hopefully I've answered everybody's questions who has sent me them. I've gotten a few requests about the exam. Hopefully this answers that, and hopefully I answered you as well. And I will see you all tomorrow morning. Well, I won't see you, but you'll see me in a sense tomorrow morning when I post your midterm exam, which will be this sort of, I hope, fun activity of trying to determine misinformation, disinformation, gaffes, etc. in political rhetoric. Okay, everybody, have a good night.